medical treatments for children that want to change gender has been based on remarkably weak evidence. That's according to a landmark review. The Cass report warned doctors were too scared to treat young people who were questioning their gender, and many were often afraid to express their views. The review, led by Dr. Hilary Cass, is calling for a more holistic approach to gender identity services.
Our focus has been on how we can get these young people to thrive by looking at them much more holistically. So I recommended that services should be moved into a paediatric setting where there's a much broader multidisciplinary team who are able to think about things like they may be neurodiverse, they may have mental health problems, they may not be in school. All of those things you need to support the young people with if they're going to thrive and they're going to be able to really address their gender issues.
NHS England has said it's reviewing the report's findings and has instructed adult gender clinics to pause first-time appointments for under-18s. Joining us is Helen Joyce, author of Transgender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights. Helen, the report partly blames pornography for kids wanting to change their gender. Do you agree with that?
I do, and it was really heartening to see that called out because too few people have noticed this. As Dr. Hilary Cass, who was literally one of the world's most eminent paediatricians, said, most children by age 11 or 12 now have seen violent and degrading, often, porn on their phones. The girls find this terrifying, and it's one of the reasons that girls get put off the idea of growing into adulthood, and it confuses and disrupts the boys' development too. So yes, this is one of the many, many excellent things in a report that you rightly call landmark.
Well then, from that perspective, if it's porn and it also says that wider problems in the world are affecting kids as well, don't we as parents need to take more responsibility ourselves to control what our kids are seeing on their phones?
Yes, I totally agree with that, but parents don't act in a vacuum and families don't either. One thing that Hilary Cass really could have said more about in this report, one of the few flaws in my opinion of it, is that she said far too little about what's going on in schools. Schools really push these ideas now. Lots of schools teach children that you are whatever sex you think you are, that it's possible neither to be male nor female, that gender is a spectrum, and that it's bigoted to think that there are only two sexes and you can't change sex, when of course that's actually just true. And she didn't really get into that at all. Now, her remit was the NHS, but since she spent some significant time talking about the sorts of reasons that children get this idea into their head that they might be trans and develop gender distress, that was a big missing piece, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, our Education Secretary, Ms Keegan, has said that all schools should be completely transparent and open with parents and tell all parents everything. But we know that there are definitely schools in this country who are letting little Johnny go to school and be called Jenny, and they're not informing parents. How are we going to stop that from happening?
It's really difficult without bringing out statutory guidance, but the draft trans guidance that the Department for Education has produced is a step forward, a big step forward in this. Now, it's at least 10 years too late, but hey, that's not Gillian Keegan's fault, so let's not blame her on that. What I think needs to happen is that the Department for Education writes a policy on where sex rather than gender or gender identity or any of these undefined terms matters in schools. It matters in places like toilets, changing rooms, sports, biology education, and what words we use for people, uniforms and so on. There's just a short list of places where it matters, and say in each of those whether it is possible that you could pretend a boy is a girl or a girl is a boy. I think if you work through that, you quickly find that there are very, very few situations where it can possibly be safe to pretend that any girl is a boy or vice versa, because it's a basic principle of safeguarding that you need to know what sex everybody is. Children can't be kept safe if we're pretending that people are the sex they aren't. It just can't be done. So if the DfE produced a model policy like that and told schools that if they follow it, any legal risk they face from parents, for example, who do want their child to transition, because there are parents who put pressure on schools, the DfE will step in and it will take over any legal risk or any admin risk from schools. That would basically solve the problem.
So if there was wholly inadequate evidence for puberty blockers, and if doctors are generally very cautious when it comes to adopting new treatments, why were so many doctors pushing these drugs on so many children?
Oh, you ask such a good question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is doctors sometimes catastrophically aren't that cautious. It's not like medical scandals don't happen. There are many of them. You just have to look back at lobotomies. You may not know this, but the guy who invented lobotomies got a Nobel Prize for it. So, you know, medical scandals just happen, and this is a medical scandal. Basically, what happened is some doctors got this sort of godlike idea, because that's a problem with some doctors as well. They like to play God, that they could intervene early and ensure that children who, when they grew up, might want to change their gender presentation would pass. Because men in particular, they go through male puberty and then they don't pass when they're adults if they want to present themselves as women to the world. And they didn't think this through. And then they should have thought it through, but they didn't apparently. And then they said that, you know, also they were stopping suicides. This was the thing that is said for the last 10 years that has terrified parents into going along with the idea that their children should take these drugs, is if you don't give them these drugs, they'll kill themselves. Charities like Mermaids told lies, saying things like better a dead daughter than a live son, which is one of the most disgraceful bits of misinformation that parents have had to navigate in the last decade. They've stopped saying that now, mercifully. One of the great things in Hilary Cass's report was that she said there is literally no evidence that children who are trans-identified are in any way more likely to commit suicide than other children with the same other mental health conditions. You listed some of them, like autism and so on. So she debunked a lot of the myths that were used by the lobby groups and by the gender doctors to say that this was life-saving treatment, that this was essential. And without that backing, without any reasons to do it, you actually look at what you're doing. And what you're doing is disrupting children's development at a really key developmental period, the second biggest developmental sprint after babyhood. Obviously, that's not something you should do unless there's an enormous overriding reason to do it. And Dr. Cass has shown there is no reason to do it.
Well, Helen, I completely agree with you, and I think this review from Dr. Cass is fantastic, but I don't think it's going to make that much difference to those people who have been advocating and pushing this ideology on our kids, and the same people who would call you and I transphobic for saying, no, a boy is a boy, a girl is a girl, you should not be giving puberty blockers to children. Those same people are going to continue to, well, I guess they'll probably disregard this and say that it's propaganda.
I mean, maybe, but what choice do we have? We can't just give up fighting for this. You know, children's lives are on the line. As Hilary Cass said, there are vulnerable children at the heart of this topic. This isn't something that we should look away from. When you see a genuine, bona fide medical scandal unfolding like this, and you realise that there's been a mass failure by institutions, failure by the regulators in healthcare, and by the clinic itself. I mean, did you register that the adult clinics refused to cooperate with Hilary Cass when she asked them for their data so she could do long-term follow-up? They flatly refused. She said they thwarted her efforts. The school's secretary, you know, this transgender guidance has been very late coming. The charity regulator, all sorts of people have really not done enough here. And people are starting to speak out now. But yes, it's much worse than if we had started to speak out 10 years ago. But you know what? The second best time to start speaking out is now. Yeah. Really. People need to.
Helen, one final question for you. Religion. What part does this play in it? Because just anecdotally, I generally don't see children from Muslim backgrounds coming forward and saying they have gender dysphoria. And now, even with the Catholic Church, the Pope has come out and said that having gender surgery is a grave violation of human dignity. Is the fact that in this country, our family values seems to have changed, they've been eroded, the traditional family values that we used to have maybe 50, 60 years ago just don't exist anymore here?
It's a great research question, but the research hasn't been done properly. And what I would say is that there's much more of an idea of everything being child-led now. And I mean, it's good to do child-centered education and so on, because it's the child who's meant to be learning, but children don't really know very much, and adults are the ones who know what's going on. And unfortunately, a lot of people have said, you know, we listen to the child. They have this idea that a 2 or a 3 or a 4-year-old can tell you who they truly are. Well, my second child was a train when he was 2, 3 and 4. I can tell you that. And he's 18 now and he's not still a train. So that's, I think, the big failing I'd point out without needing to wait for the research, because this research has been done more generally, which is that people are abdicating responsibility to children in all sorts of areas. And I think this is one of them.
I completely agree with you, Helen. My kid likes to be a fire engine and he's 3. Is there a
Very
risk?
Sweet.
Is there a risk that when we say a child who thinks they are a different gender is most probably linked to a mental health issue. Is there a risk we're going to get pushback on that, of people saying, well, then you are dismissing this child's true feelings and saying that they're mentally unwell?
Well, I mean, I'd turn it around and say the other way around. I'd say that if this isn't good treatment, what you're actually doing is you're letting those kids down. I mean, it's not bigoted to say about trans-identified children that they should have the same standard of care as everybody else. And Hilary Cass says they weren't given the same standard of care. They were given substandard care. So actually, they've been discriminated against, if you want to put it in that language, by being treated without the evidence base that we would expect in any other treatment of distressed children.
Okay, Helen Joyce, thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to speak to you.